thought of Cochrane Rehabilitation and Cochrane Fields in general as a bridge, but importantly, it's a two-way bridge. So one way, Cochrane, the fields like Cochrane Rehabilitation is trying to help disseminate information and evidence that Cochrane is producing to people who might be able to make use of it. So rehabilitation professionals, consumers of rehabilitation services, and so forth. But equally, Cochrane Rehabilitation and other fields are about those communities of stakeholders, rehabilitation stakeholders, informing the work that Cochrane ought to be doing. And at the end of this presentation, depending on time, I've got some slides to do with the problems, the methodological problems that occur with the Cochrane model for development of evidence that Cochrane Rehabilitation actually is currently actively involved with trying to address or confront, I guess. And part of that is the understanding that the way Cochrane has traditionally approached evidence production doesn't actually address all the types of clinical questions that we might want to raise from a rehabilitation perspective. And so this is something that we are sort of actively trying to address at the moment. So that's the Cochrane, the rehabilitation community trying to influence and inform the work of Cochrane. So we have a bunch of goals in Cochrane Rehabilitation about connecting rehabilitation stakeholders globally, about translating evidence, knowledge from research into rehabilitation practice. We are developing a registry of rehabilitation-related reviews, which are available on the Cochrane Rehabilitation website. We are working on educating rehabilitation stakeholders internationally, low and middle income countries, as well as high income countries. And we're developing, we're working on the development of new methods for undertaking systematic reviews relevant to rehabilitation to try and produce better evidence from Cochrane that's more informative for practice. And we're promoting both Cochrane to rehabilitation people, and we're promoting rehabilitation to Cochrane people. So you can, if you just Google Cochrane Rehabilitation, it will take you to this website, and this is an old screenshot, but all the latest news that's coming out of publications from Cochrane and stuff is published on the website. There's quite an active group who's involved with producing that. But what I wanted to talk about mostly today was about how to read a systematic review. I've written this part of the presentation not so much as how to critically appraise a systematic review, which is another topic, but rather from the perspective of, if I've got a clinical question, how do I go about extracting data quickly from a Cochrane review to make a decision about whether or not a review is useful or not useful for helping me answer a clinical question. So this is kind of like a bit of a speed run through a Cochrane review. So I think the first thing just to mention is to make a distinction between what's a systematic review and what's a narrative review or a traditional review of literature. The characteristics of a good systematic review are that the review is a review of research on a particular topic that follows a predetermined and repeatable methodology. Ideally, that methodology ought to have been developed and published prior to the work on the review being conducted. And so that's about keeping the researchers honest so that they don't shift the goalposts to match what evidence they find. So you need to start with a research question, a review question, and develop a protocol to address that review question, and that's sort of increasing the trustworthiness and credibility of the work that's being produced. And there's a bunch of criteria that I won't go into in the interest of time that you can look at in terms of determining what a good systematic review might look like as well. There are critical appraisal tools. There's one called AmStar 2. There was an AmStar number 1. There's AmStar 2 now that you can use for critically appraising the quality of systematic reviews. But as one example, I'm just going to come back to, this is a Cochrane review that's about 5 years old now, about the effectiveness of goal setting and strategies to enhance goal pursuit or adults with acquired disability participating in rehabilitation. So the question underpinning this review is that if you add goal setting to a rehabilitation regime and rehabilitation program, does that improve outcomes for patients? And what are the characteristics of goals that result in the best outcomes for patients? That's the question underpinning this particular very complicated review. So the first thing to look for when you are reading a Cochrane review is what question was being asked. And can I see a show of hands who's familiar with the PICO acronym? Okay, oh, well, okay. So the PICO acronym, PICO, is a starting point for creating an objective understanding of your question. And so your question, your clinical question that you're coming to Cochrane with should be dividable into these sort of components. The first component is the population. Who is the study about? So it could be people with spinal cord injury, it could be people with traumatic brain injury, and so forth. So who is the population that the review is about? Second thing is I, which is intervention. What is the intervention or the clinical strategy or the program of rehabilitation or whatever that is the subject of the review? C is comparison or control group. What is that being compared to? O is outcome. What outcomes did they measure in the system? What outcomes were they collecting data on in the systematic review? What were the primary outcomes and what were the secondary outcomes that people were looking at? And then sometimes people put T on the end, so it's PCOT rather than PICO, to refer to what was the time of the endpoint when the outcomes were measured. A year after the completion of an intervention, or 6 weeks after the completion of an intervention. So with Cochrane reviews, you can look at the title to get a sense of the population and the intervention should be stated in the title, but the methods in Cochrane reviews break down each of these sorts of things: population, intervention, comparison and control group, outcome, ought to be separate subheadings in the method section, so you can really tell what each systematic review was looking at. So a good systematic review should have a really clear operationalized study. So in this review on goal setting in rehabilitation as an intervention, we've got a definition of the types of studies that were included, the types of participants, and further down what counted as a goal setting intervention, and what were considered reasonable comparisons to be made. When I am reading a systematic review and I'm trying to make a decision about whether or not I should consider the evidence from the systematic review, I first look at what question the systematic review was asking, as I've just done. And the second thing I look at is how many studies we've found, because sometimes you find systematic reviews that have only published that have only included 1 or 2 clinical trials, in which case I'm immediately a little bit more skeptical of the conclusions that are reached. So I often look next at how many studies we've found. So you can do this for a quick overview. You can scan the abstract in a Cochrane review to find how many studies we've found. So up here in this review of goal setting, there were 39 studies that were included in this particular review, and you can see these 39 studies included 2,846 participants. Yeah. But you can also drill down a little bit more in Cochrane reviews, where there is a statement about a particular finding from a Cochrane review. And so for each finding, you can see, well, for this finding, although there were 39 studies in this review, only 8 studies contributed to this particular finding with 446 participants and so forth. So, so you might have a number of studies that contributed to the review as a whole, and then for each finding from the review, sort of a subset of those studies. Oh, can make another computer go. The next thing I would look at is what were the main outcomes that were being considered in a systematic review. And again, for a quick overview, I would have a look at the abstract and I would have a look at the author summary and the lay summary. So in all Cochrane reviews, there is a comprehensive abstract at the beginning of the review, and then there is a paragraph which is the author's summary of the findings from that review. And then underneath that, there is a summary that is written for people who aren't scientists or aren't experts in this particular area. That ought to involve a language that anybody can understand. That's the aim of those lay summaries. There's a real art in writing a good lay summary, but often that actually sometimes is more informative than the author's summary. So here we've got so here's an example of where you can find the main outcomes for this systematic review. This systematic review concluded that the studies provided very low quality of evidence. So that's a statement about the quality of evidence, that any type of goal setting in the practice of adult rehabilitation is better than no goal setting for health-related quality of life or self-reported emotional status. And this is where we've got these 8 studies, and we've got a statement about the effect size, which is standard mean difference. I'll come back to that in a second, and efficacy and so forth. So findings in Cochrane reviews are pretty much always reported as risk ratios or odds ratios, mean differences or standard mean differences. And I'm going to just talk through these types of things. One of the things I really like about the Cochrane approach to systematic reviews is that it cuts through a lot of the nonsense complicated by statistical analyses that most of us don't understand unless we've done at least a master's qualification in biostatistics. And it sort of says the aim of a Cochrane review is to sort of say, yeah, what does it actually mean in terms of how many people were better or how much better people were? And so things end up being reported in this kind of way. So the first type of outcome that gets reported is either risk ratios or odds ratios. There's a fairly sort of complicated explanation about the differences between these two types of things, but you can just sort of think of them generally in terms of likelihood. And risk ratios and odds ratios always refer to count data. So out of a population of 100 people, how many people were dead after 6 months? How many people were re-hospitalized after 6 months? Or how many people returned to work after 6 months? So it's a proportion. And risk ratios and odds ratios report how much more likely people were to achieve a particular outcome or be in a particular situation at a certain time point in comparison to another group who didn't get that intervention. One thing to know about risk ratios and odds ratios is that a score of 1 means that there was no difference between two groups. So you can think of it in terms of times more likely. So if we ended up with a risk ratio of 2, then the intervention group were 2 times more likely than the control group to have that particular outcome. Now, if your outcome of interest is rehospitalization, then being 2 times more likely to be rehospitalized is a bad thing. But if your outcome of interest is return to work, then 2 times more likely is a good thing. So it does depend what you're looking at in terms of whether or not it's good or bad in favor of a particular intervention. Risk ratios don't drop below 0, so they go towards from 1 to 0. So you end up with a risk ratio of something like 0.8, which might be people are 0.8 times more likely, which means less likely to end up rehospitalized or dead or at work at a certain period of time. So scores less than 1 mean less likely, scores more than 1 mean more likely. And this is just an example of this kind of data from a systematic review on early supported discharge services for people with acute stroke. This data can be summarized that for the people who receive early supported discharge services, 400 out of 1,000 people were likely to be dead or dependent, and so they had a likelihood of 40% in terms of this particular outcome. And this can be represented by 100 smiley faces with 40% of them having a negative outcome that we're not wanting. And then over here, we've got the control group who didn't have early supported discharge, early discharge services, where we had 450 people out of 1,000 who were dead or dependent. So we've got slightly more smiley faces, unhappy faces there. And this is used to produce, oh, wrong keyboard.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's making the noise. I think it's one of your computers.
It's I've got, yeah, that's right. It's my computer making noises. So you end up with an odds ratio of 0.8, which means that these people were less likely to be dead or dependent if they received the early supported discharge services than the control group who didn't. That's kind of the way to interpret things. The other thing just to highlight here is this idea of 95% confidence interval. 95% confidence intervals are really worth getting familiar with. And what these mean is that our, based on the evidence that we have, our best estimate of the impact of early supported discharge services is a odds ratio of 0.8, a reduction in the likelihood of death and dependency of 0.8. But a 95% confidence interval is a estimate of how precise or how accurate we think that estimate of effect is. So it might be that people are a lot less likely and they have an odds ratio of 0.07, or much more likely to end up dead or dependent, in which case they'll have an odds ratio of 0.95. And so the true effect size will fall somewhere on that spectrum. The thing is that even 0.95 is a good thing. That's still an improvement, is the thing. And so this is an indication that early supported discharge programs are probably a good thing. And so this adds to our confidence that this is something we ought to be doing in clinical practice. So mean differences are another way of reporting outcomes. So I've come back to this thing here. We've done risk ratios, odds ratios. We're going to talk about mean differences. So mean differences is simply the difference between the average score on the same outcome for two groups. So you've got functional independence measure, or you've got the Piper fatigue scale, or you've got a quality of life measure, and you've got two groups of people. Both have been measured with that particular outcome, and you've got an average score for two groups of people. So the average score is the mean score for that particular population, and so the difference between the average score between two groups is your mean difference. So mean differences, the differences in average scores between two populations, is reported in the same units of measurement as the outcome measure. So if your measure was the 6-minute walk test, then your outcome would be measured in meters walked further, and the mean difference would be reported in meters walked further. But if you've got mean differences for SF36, the short form 36 that measures quality of life, there aren't any units of measurement, so there won't be any units of measurement with the mean differences. So unlike risk ratios, where we had a score of 1, that meant there was no difference between two groups. In this case, if we've got a score of 0 in terms of the mean difference, that's an indication that there's no difference between two groups. So we want to see more or less of a score. And the scores can range from anything that's normal for that particular scale. So here's an example of a 6-minute run test as opposed to a 6-minute walk test, where you've got one group of people. Some people in maybe this group's got some special running training. This group didn't get the special running training. Some people in this group are running faster and further in a 6-minute run test than some people in that group, but on average this group is doing better. On average this group is doing running 12,200 meters, and so the mean difference is the difference between these two particular scores. So here's an example of data on a 6-minute walk test from one of my favorite Cochrane reviews on pulmonary rehabilitation for chronic pulmonary disease. And so this study here reported that people who receive pulmonary rehabilitation are able to walk 43.3 0.39 meters further on a 6-minute walk test than people who don't receive pulmonary rehabilitation or chronic lung disease. And again, I will highlight for you, we can see here studies, we've got 38 studies and 1,870 participants that have been contributing to this data, but also I want to highlight for you here the 95% confidence interval. So again, our mean difference is our best estimate of the true effect size of pulmonary rehabilitation on 6-minute walk test performance in comparison to people who don't receive pulmonary rehabilitation. But our 95% confidence interval is our information about how precise this effect size is. So it could be that people were actually able to do 55 meters further than the other group, or 32 meters further, which is less impressive, but still arguably significant. So the third way of doing things is this is a comparison of standard mean differences. Can I see a show of hands? Who's familiar with standard mean differences? So the reason why we might want to use a standard mean difference is if you are wanting to pull the findings from multiple studies for a particular outcome, like quality of life, for example, but you've got a bunch of studies and they've all used different measures of quality of life. Or you might want to measure the impact of a particular exercise regime on community reintegration, but everybody's used a different measure of community reintegration. Or you might want to,
I was just trying to mute your thing, but I can't.
No. And so what systematic review people will do is they will convert the measure for one particular study from the raw data of the mean difference to a mean difference that's a proportion of one standard deviation for that population. And so you end up with everything being converted as a proportion of a standard deviation, and then you can compile it because you've converted it into a common metric. That's a little bit complicated, but if you think back to your fifth form maths, I don't know if we did this in fifth form actually, but you have your sort of normal distribution pattern, and if you remember, one standard deviation of normal distribution is 68% of the population. So 68% of your measurements will fall within one standard deviation, and 95% of your measures will fall within 2 standard deviations. It's ringing bells. What we are looking at is 2 of these distribution curves, one for the control group and one for the intervention group, and we're comparing how far apart these two distributions are for a standard mean difference. The difference in the means is a proportion of one standard deviation. That's how it's done. And there's, if you want to see a visual representation of this, there's this website it's worth having a little bit of a look at, and it gives you a chance to sort of play with normal distributions and pull them apart and see what impact it has on standard mean difference. But all that aside, this is what's worth knowing, that if you have a standard mean difference of 0, that's an indication that there's no difference between 2 treatment groups. If you've got a standard mean difference of larger than 8, then people tend to say that's a large difference. And so one way of thinking about this is that if you get 2 groups of people and you measure them on the SF36, for example, and at the end they start off in the same position, and at the end of your rehabilitation period of time, one group is 1 whole standard deviation better off in terms of their mean than the other population. That's a big difference. 1 standard deviation is quite a substantial improvement on that particular score. So that's kind of how to interpret this information. And there are these other cutoffs that are considered that are sort of people sort of use as benchmarks for what might be considered a small effect or a moderate effect. Little word of caution about standard mean difference is that these cutoffs are entirely arbitrary. They're somewhat arbitrary, not entirely arbitrary, somewhat arbitrary. And the person who created this whole sort of way of evaluating effect sizes, Cohen, actually said this is an operation fraught with many dangers. But it's a very useful tool, is the thing. So again, coming back to this thing about what were the main findings, I've talked about looking at the abstract. If you're wanting to read a bit more detail because the abstract has captured your attention, then you should dive into the summary of findings tables in Cochrane reviews and look at the forest plots as well. So the summary of findings tables are a relatively new introduction. So the older, the reviews that are sort of 10 years old or older don't have summary of findings tables yet, but the newer reviews, and when reviews are updated, summary of finding tables are added. So these are usually right at the top of the review. So I'm just going to walk you through this now. So with a summary of findings tables, you should look at the top and down the side to see what PICO question is being answered with the summary of findings table. So at the top, we've got a summary of findings about the intervention that's being explored and the population that's being explored. And down the left-hand side here, we've got the outcomes that are being reported. So you have a series of rows associated with different outcomes that were evaluated. I think it's useful to check the number of participants and the number of studies that have contributed data. 446 is quite small for a systematic review, so that's kind of like something that adds a degree of uncertainty to the findings. And then have a look at reading the main findings that were reported. And these are often reported as illustrative comparative risks. And so there is an assumed risk if no goal setting, in this case is the goal setting thing, if no goal setting was provided, then you would score, then you could expect populations of people to score something like this on the SF36. And then if they were provided rehabilitation that had an element of goal setting in it, then there's a statement here about how much better off this group is than this group, that particular outcome. And then you might want to have a look at statements about the quality of the evidence and the comments. So there is some statements here about the degree to which we can trust this evidence based on the quality of the science that have been conducted. Forest plots. So forest plots can be a little bit overwhelming in terms of how much information they contain if you're not familiar with them, but they actually, when you are familiar with them, they're a really great source of evidence for practice. So again, in a forest plot, these will be in the analysis section of all Cochrane reviews and often many systematic reviews published in other journals. So again, at the top, you want to have a look at the details of the comparison that are being reported on. So we should have the intervention and the population that's being produced in the comparison group and which health outcome is being reported. So in this case, we've got goal setting or strategies to enhance goal pursuit for adults with acquired disability participating in rehabilitation, comparing rehabilitation where goal setting has been provided versus rehabilitation where rehabilitation therapies were provided without any goal setting. And the outcome in this case is health-related quality of life or self-reported emotional status. And so first thing here is on the left-hand side here, you can see all the studies that contributed data to each, to this particular meta-analysis. And the data from the intervention group and from the control group are reported in the middle here. So we have means and standard deviations and the sample size of these studies. You can see here, these are all relatively small studies, one here with 7 participants in each group. And for the control group as well. And you can see up here, it says, this is goal setting and no goal setting. So these are the goal setting and no goal setting arms of each of these studies. Down the bottom here, you can see the total number of participants that were in each of the control and intervention group. And over here, we have the standard mean difference. Or it might be the mean difference, or it might be the risk ratio, odds ratio, like I reported, like I've talked about earlier. But the look of the graph is just the same. This here is reporting the standard mean difference between the intervention and control group. And for each each individual study, the reported standard mean difference, the reported difference between the means has been converted into a standard mean difference. And this difference is reported as a green dot down here. And you can see the scale on which it is being reported. And because it's a standard mean difference, a change of a score of 1 would be 1 standard deviation difference. And you can tell whether or not this is a 1 standard deviation difference or whatever in favor of the control group versus the intervention group, because it tells you down the bottom here. It says favors goal setting or favors no goal setting. You can see you've got one study here where there's a difference between the two groups that actually favored the group that didn't get goal setting. These black lines are the whiskers, and they are the 95% confidence interval, how confident we can be that this estimate is fitting somewhere on this particular line for this particular study. And that's just like I was talking about with the 95% confidence interval. And there is this line down the middle here, which is the line of no effect, because it's standard mean difference, or if it was the mean difference, this line of no effect sits on 0. But if it was a risk ratio or an odds ratio, this line of no difference would sit on 1. Yep. And so if the 95% confidence interval whisker crosses this line of no difference, then traditionally we would have said that this is a study that produced no evidence of a statistically significant difference, a p-value of more than 0.05. It's the same effectively. So here would be a study that reported a group of people who got goal setting were statistically more likely to had a statistically significant higher score on some measure of quality of life in comparison to the control group that got interventions without goal setting. And here's 1, 2, 3 studies where the authors probably reported there was no statistically significant difference between the two groups on measures of quality of life. Yep. So we've got some studies where these things have been significant and some studies where they haven't been significant. Prior to this, because this is one of my systematic reviews, prior to the systematic review, I actually published a non-Cochrane review on the same topic about 10 years ago to examine whether or not goal setting improved outcomes for people in rehabilitation. And in that particular review, I didn't conduct a meta-analysis. So instead, I did what lots of people would do, which would be to say, some studies have found a significant difference and some studies have not found a significant difference, so we can't be confident about what the true effect of goal setting is, but it seems possible that there might be something useful here. But the advantage, I've spelled pulled wrong, the advantage of meta-analysis is that we can pull this data statistically. And because we've converted all these different measures into one metric, which is a standard mean difference, we can pull them all in with this meta-analysis. And so the product of the meta-analysis, the pooled means and 95% confidence intervals for all these studies get pulled into this diamond at the bottom of the forest plot. All forest plots look like this, so you should be able to look at any forest plot, read what it's about, and feel confident about what the summary of that analysis is. The mean score for the pooled data sits in the middle of this diamond. And the 95% confidence interval is the width of the diamond. One of the things about meta-analyses is because you are pooling more data from more people, our estimate of what the true effect size becomes more precise. So our 95% confidence interval ends up much smaller than any of these individual studies, which is again one of the advantages of this type of thing. Over here, we have exactly the same information as here, but it's presented numerically rather than visually. And so down the bottom here, we've got a standard mean difference, which is this diamond here, to say that the differences between these two groups is 0.53, about half of 1 standard deviation on whatever measure people have used to evaluate quality of life. It could be as low as 0.17, which isn't all that impressive, or it could be as large as 0.88, which is very impressive. And one thing just to highlight there is that's a very wide confidence interval from almost no effect, some through to quite a significant effect. And this means that there's actually quite a lot of uncertainty about what the true effect sizes of goal setting and rehabilitation. We need more studies and blah, blah, blah. But it's a starting point. So if you've read the results of a Cochrane review and you are still interested because they seem interesting, then you might want to, at that point, start doing things like drilling down in terms of looking at the quality of the evidence, the critically appraising, looking at the critical appraisal of the individual studies, getting a sense of how certain or sure you can be about those findings. And also at that point, you ought to be interested in what were the characteristics of the actual interventions that were used to produce these findings. What approach to goal setting was used that produced these findings? Is it similar to what we're wanting to introduce and what we do use in our environments? And it's useful looking at the settings, the environment in which these studies were conducted. Were they in a well-funded university hospital, or were they in a rural setting? And what were the authors' discussions and conclusions? So if I get to this point and I'm thinking they've only got a couple of studies, there's not much evidence of an effect size of interest, then I might stop reading the review at that point, and I don't really care what the author's conclusions were. But it's with the studies that really sort of piqued my interest about, for example, early supported discharge planning for stroke, that I might sort of drill down into the discussion section of a systematic review. So what I'm saying throughout this very long diatribe is that you don't have to read from woe to go. You can pick and select the information you need in order to make decisions about whether or not a review is actually going to help guide decisions in clinical practice. A little word about evaluating the quality of evidence. So when we get a finding like this, that goal setting, any type of goal setting in rehabilitation improves health-related quality of life by half of one standard deviation on any measure you use, then we want to make a statement about how sure we can be regarding that particular outcome. And the thing that's used nowadays in Cochrane, that's a relatively recent introduction, is this thing called grade. And grade's a way of evaluating the quality of evidence. There's some debate about the components of grade, but it's certainly a good starting point. And there's and grade scores are based. I should actually just give you an example of a grade score back here. The grade of the evidence is on the basis of how many pluses you get. So a result that you can feel very confident will have 4 pluses, but this one's only got 1 plus. So that's when we've got very low grade of evidence. And below this summary of findings table, there are footnotes 3, 4, and 5 that talk about the reasons why this evidence was downgraded. But the sort of components to this are risk of bias, how good were the study methods. That's the one we're most familiar with. That's the critical appraisal of the randomized controlled trials or whatever in terms of risk of bias. Then there's this question of inconsistency, and this is about heterogeneity in the outcome. So just eyeballing this forest plot, we can see that the effect size deviates wildly. And so that should raise some questions about why is there this heterogeneity in outcomes as a response to goal setting in rehabilitation. And there's some really easy explanations to offer to begin with, which is people probably taking different approaches to goal setting. The rehabilitation, the environment in which people were conducting these studies could have been quite different. So there wasn't one population of people, it was a whole range of different people with different types of health conditions. And so there's lots of different reasons why this variability might occur. But this means, this introduces some uncertainty about how effective goal setting will be in your environment with your people you work with in terms of its impact on health outcomes. Your people could be really benefiting from up here or not benefiting quite so much. And then there's undirectedness. How closely do the included studies align with our clinical questions? So you might find a study that's about early supported discharge after stroke, and you're sort of thinking, well, actually my population of people is people with acquired brain injury and traumatic brain injury. How relevant is that data to my particular population? So if the review question was about early supported discharge for people with acquired brain injury, and they only found studies to do with stroke, then the conclusions regarding acquired brain injury would be would have a problem with directedness. And then imprecision is this question of how wide those confidence intervals are. So if you remember back to the example I gave with the goal setting one, that was the reason why that particular finding was downgraded in terms of the grade score, because goal setting might only have a very small impact on outcome, or it might have a large impact on outcome. So we're a bit unsure about the actual effect size. And then there's the notion of publication bias, which I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into details. So very quickly, in 5 minutes, I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of what Cochrane Rehabilitation is working on now, where to from here. I actually put more slides, as I want to do, I put more slides in than I could possibly cover in 1 hour, because depending on the show of hands at the beginning, I might have focused more on this part of the presentation. Maybe I can come back and do another presentation if people are interested. But Cochrane has this strategy to 2020, where it talks about putting Cochrane at the evidence of health decision-making all over the world. This is what they are wanting to do as a business, as a non-profit business. And they're also wanting to, part of this thing is about getting a bit more contemporary in terms of producing the evidence. They want the evidence that they produce, that Cochrane produces, to be defined by the needs of end users. So these are consumers and rehabilitation and health professionals and governments developing policies, and to continue to develop innovative methods for designing and conducting review evidence syntheses, rather than just focusing on randomized controlled trials for drug trials, for example. And just as a little anecdote, I actually have a PhD student who's working on this particular issue at the moment. But back in February 2017, I did a very cursory scoping review of all the reviews to do with traumatic brain injury rehabilitation in the Cochrane Library. And I only found a small number of reviews, 25 reviews. Only 13 were exclusively about traumatic brain injury. The others involved traumatic brain injury and something else. Many of them were out of date with protocols. Meta-analysis had only been attempted in 6 of these 25 reviews. Only 2 of the exclusively TBI reviews, and the majority of these came to the conclusion that there was insufficient evidence to make recommendations to clinical practice. So I think this is a really good example of where Cochrane isn't achieving its objectives to be at the heart of decision-making all over the world. Cochrane doesn't tell us anything about what we should be doing in terms of rehabilitation for people with traumatic brain injury. We've got some great information and evidence about what we should do with people when they come into ED, but not what we should do with them after that. And so I have a PhD student who's doing an overview of systematic reviews to try and identify what the problem is with these reviews, what are the main problems that are contributing to this. And she's also interviewing some of the leading many of the leading rehabilitation researchers who work in traumatic brain injury to interview them about their experiences of conducting clinical trials with people with traumatic brain injury. In my experience of working with people with traumatic brain injury clinical trials is that they're not where you left them, and so 1-year follow-up is often very difficult. An extremely heterogeneous population, blinding is next to impossible. So all the sorts of things that downgrade evidence make the Cochrane method not suitable, I think, for questions to do with TBI rehabilitation. So we could talk about that a lot more, but I'll leave it at that. Except to say there's increasing international interest in the emergence of the interest in non-randomized study design. So there was this paper published 2 years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the top 3 medical journals, about evidence-based healthcare decision-making beyond randomized controlled trials. And that's a really interesting paper about different methodologies. There's the emergence of other methods or tools for assessing risk of bias in non-randomized controlled studies. the development of systematic review methods for N-of-1 studies, and of course the big emphasis on big data now that comes through. In Cochrane Rehabilitation, we conducted a international review of priorities for future methodological research that we've published. Just this month, we've published a special issue of the European Journal of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. Rochelle is a co-author on 2 papers in this special issue, and in this particular special issue, we are wanting to look at questions to do with challenging the status quo regarding systematic reviews from the perspective of clinical needs of rehabilitation providers. So, so my paper in this particular collection of papers is about how control groups are managed in systematic reviews. These are all open access, freely available, so you can just download these papers if you're interested in them. And finally, 1 minute over time. If you're interested in the work of Cochrane Rehabilitation and you want to just keep up to date with the news, you can visit our website, which I've got up there. You can just Google it, easy to find. The website also has a link for getting updates about what Cochrane is up to, and so you can email cochrane.rehabilitation@gmail.com to ask to be put on the mailing list. Just email them and say, can you put me on the mailing list, thank you, and you'll get the occasional newsletter that reports publications that have come out or work that's been conducted internationally. They also produce these things called Cochrane Corners, which are a 1-slide summary of the findings from a particular review, and at the moment we're working on this thing which is going to be an ebook in rehabilitation, and the ambitious aim here is to summarize all the evidence related to rehabilitation in one living electronic book that will be free to access, so that you can find evidence on particular topics. So that's something that we're working on to try and disseminate this information. We're also working on stuff to do with improving reporting standards for clinical trials relevant to, anyway, it's busy, relevant to rehabilitation. You can follow us on Twitter, that's another way to go. Follow me on Twitter at Dr. Levack. And on Facebook as well. So that's all the things there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, William. It's great to have you here. And every time I hear you talk about how to read a Cochrane review, I learn something more. The biggest trick I got is don't print out a Cochrane review. They're about 200 pages long. So as I don't know if you saw on the slide, William was using the table of contents bar down the right-hand side to navigate through the review. Yeah. That is the single most thing you can do to stop yourself going insane, is use that rather than scrolling down through the review. Use the contents buttons. Yeah,
that's a really good point, actually. I almost never download a Cochrane review now, even, because it's harder to read through a PDF of a Cochrane review. That the online if you found a Cochrane review in the Cochrane Library, the online navigation menu is so much easier to use. There's a section called Analysis. You can click on that, and then you can just click through all the forest plots all in one go, sort of thing.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you. As you can hear, William's had a lot of experience. He's got a lot of ideas, and has got his fingers in lots of little pies. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. But thank you very much for coming down and sharing your expertise. And it's just been lovely to see you all here and to see such a wide range of clinicians and people who live with the experience of disability and people that are involved in research, and just this lovely little pool of, and online as well. Don't go offline because I'll get your email addresses if you want a certificate. And yeah, if you could tick that you attended on the sheet that is on the back of the table, and tick if you want a certificate, because you can use it as part of your CPD to show that you now know everything there is to know about Cochrane reviews, and that you can read them in a jiffy, yeah, and speak eloquently at your next NDT meeting. Yeah. Hey, so thank you very much. Have a lovely day, and thanks for coming. Thank you.